January 28, 2026. It's year 4, day 339 since the full-scale invasion began. Welcome to the Daily Situation Report. In today's report, we see another plan from the Ukrainians on how they want to shape the next year and move closer to peace. This is now the Ukrainian side, which we will look at next. But we also see attacks, especially on passenger trains. And what we also see, of course, are changes at the front, as well as, for once, tougher measures from Europe directed at Russian Shadow Fleet tankers, and much more. Ukraine has a new plan for peace. They want to put more pressure on Russia than before. So far, we've seen little pressure from the Ukrainian side, aside from destroyed refineries or fuel depots. Let's take a closer look at that now. They initially reported around the turn of the year that they plan to be more offensive in 2026. After that, they reported that in the future, they want to inflict about 50,000 monthly losses on the Russians. Currently, we're at about 35,000, and now they've announced the third measure, which is supposed to lead to a quick peace. Let's take a look at how they plan to do that. The attempt to get Russia to end the war through diplomacy or international pressure has so far been unsuccessful. Against this background, Ukraine is increasingly pursuing a different approach. They want to raise the military costs for Moscow so much that the war can no longer be sustained in the long run. In addition to offensives and losses, drones are also supposed to play a central role. According to Kiev, already more than 80% of all Russian targets are being attacked by drones, most of which are produced domestically in Ukraine. The reported Russian losses were recently about 30,000 soldiers per month, most of whom were caused by drones. For a long time, it was assumed that Russia could easily replace such losses because they have a large population that they can theoretically draw on, and there were also many voluntary enlistments. But this assessment is currently starting to waver a bit. The Russians are now paying less for a contract with the Ministry of Defense. Bonus payments have been eliminated in many regions, and target numbers are expected to decrease slightly. At the same time, they want to make preparations to eventually be able to involve reservists in the so-called special operation as well. According to the Ukrainian military leadership, Russian losses now exceed recruitment numbers, even if only by a small margin. However, if this trend intensifies, Moscow would be forced to either rely on reservists, whom they wanted to mobilize anyway, or increase the pressure on their own population through another new mobilization. Of course, that would again bring a lot of dissatisfaction, because mobilization in Russia is extremely unpopular, and above all, it would further worsen the shortage of skilled workers within the struggling Russian economy, which in turn would mean lower revenues for this war. Whether even sharply rising losses will actually lead to a change of thinking in the Kremlin remains open, of course. I doubt it. Namely, the losses would increase and Ukraine would be able to recapture territories as well. Then I see a greater willingness to negotiate than if there were only heavy losses. The Russian leadership still shows no willingness to end the war, even at great cost. But in Kiev, they are still counting on the military and social price eventually being higher than the benefit of limited territorial gains. To achieve this goal, Ukraine is simultaneously pushing ahead with the expansion of its drone capabilities. The goal is to use effective tactics from individual units throughout, because so far, only about 8–10% of Ukrainian units are responsible for almost 80–90% of the losses at the front. They also aim to further expand their technological superiority. The new target for annual drone production is supposed to be about 7 million drones, which would be 2.5 million more drones than were produced in 2025. From the perspective of the Ukrainian leadership, this is less of an option and more of a necessity and a question of long-term survival. In the Kharkiv region, a civilian passenger train was attacked by Russian drones. 5 people died in the attack. Attacks often target civilian vehicles, buildings, trains, or civilians themselves. The background to this is that a regular drone usually only has a battery life of about. So if the Russians carry out an attack that goes a bit further, They use up a lot of energy just to reach the target area in the first place. Often so much that returning isn't worth it. If they can't find a military target, for example, because they had poor reconnaissance or the target is already out of range, then of course they still want to use the drone in some other way. Lacking enough power for the return flight, they attack the next best target. So that the drone attack has some kind of effect, at least that seems to be the case with most attacks, because if we take a look at the videos on the Russian side, you can often see the battery life in the uploaded footage. So basically in the heads-up display of the drone display, and you can often see that the drone is usually close to the end of its battery life before crashing into a civilian target. That's not always true. We saw the opposite in Kherson. But that's how it is in most videos, at least. Russian soldiers dance in front of their comrades. The video itself isn't really spectacular. A few Africans who have joined the Russian army haven't been unusual for a long time. But take a look at the last frame. Russian Ratnik helmets. At the beginning, we saw that the Russian army handed out ones from 2015 because they were poorly prepared for the war. They were expired for 7 years. Which isn't that bad in itself. You can usually still eat the stuff, it just doesn't taste good anymore. At least on paper they had enough. In reality though, many were sold under the table. What do you think? Why does it also say on the MRIS side, not suitable for sale? And yet I still got one through indirect means. And it's a current one, so a durable one, which I used for my magnetic resonance imaging test video where I compared a Ukrainian and a Russian one side by side. Capitalism always finds its way, but if this recording is supposed to be current, and it is, and if the Russians have some again, then I don't assume that they're from 2015 to 2020, so they were probably able to solve this problem and can distribute field rations again. The shelter they're in didn't really look like it was close to the front to me, but until then, the supply and logistics are still working, possibly with goods that haven't been expired for years. For us, since I often criticize Russian logistics, it means that it still works up to a certain point. But from the moment it reaches that shelter, all the way to the trenches at the front, the quality drops rapidly. Let's revisit Pokrovsk. There have been few recent reports, and the situation map shows little change. With Munarath, it's still the case that we don't know who completely controls the village. It's still marked in a darker orange instead of the typical gray zone yellow on my situation map, which, by the way, you all can access. That shows it's mostly dominated by the Russians, which is true. However, there are still no Russian geolocations on the outskirts confirming their presence. Meanwhile, fighting around Rizhin continues. The Russians are currently bombing the town center here. Recently, we looked at 2 geolocations of Russian soldiers here, one during a capture and another one here. That's where they were spotted moving through the town. This area remains a gray zone, but reports of fighting along the contact line are increasing, and the Russians are trying to force the Ukrainians out of their positions a few hundred meters away with airstrikes. By the way, there are no territorial gains to report for today. 14 European countries have jointly warned Russia in a statement that tankers from the so-called Shadow Fleet will no longer be able to operate undisturbed in the Baltic Sea. It also makes sense to significantly restrict the circumvention of sanctions and opaque oil transports. Belgium, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Sweden, and the United Kingdom signed the declaration. Specifically, the document states that tankers, this is especially important now, ships that change flags, turn off transponders, or lack required documents will be classified as without state affiliation in the future. And as a result, they will effectively lose the legal protection that the Russian Shadow Fleet has relied on up to now. This signals, after a long time, a much tougher approach by Europe towards Russia's maritime circumvention structures. But it was already necessary for a very long time. And now, in 2026, you really have to ask yourself, why not 4 years ago? The Ukrainian Security Service of Ukraine, has released videos showing attacks on Russian aircraft in occupied Crimea from the year 2025. According to the Security Service of Ukraine, the following Russian aircraft were hit or disabled in the process. 2 Sukhoi 30SMs, which are really high-value targets, 2 Sukhoi 27S, 2 Mikoyan Gurevich 31s, 5 Sukhoi 24s, 2 An-26S, which are quite rare, 2 Mil 26S, 1 Mi-28, and 1 Mi-8 helicopter. So we see what I've been saying for a long time. The Ukrainians' drone superiority, or rather their drone capabilities and attacks, are steadily increasing in Crimea. A few years ago, such targets could only be reached by cruise missiles or medium-range rockets, but today even regular drones, which weren't even countered, can do it. The released footage is meant to prove that Ukraine has expanded its ability to strike sensitive military targets deep within Russian-controlled territory in Crimea. And I think we'll see an increase here in 2026, which I'm already very excited about. Thank you to all subscribers, channel members, and the Algo crew. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Reneka, Robert Siller, Dietrich Brady, and Mero Hofer. Please subscribe, like, and comment. See you in the next Situation Report.